This is the Age of Jackson, Element 1, about the corrupt bargain of 1824 and how it ruined the domestic policies of this guy, John Quincy Adams, the son of the second president of the United States, John Adams. Now, the corrupt bargain of 1824 had to do with the election of John Quincy Adams, and in that election, John Quincy Adams was going up against this guy, a rather cantankerous fellow named Andrew Jackson, also known as Old Hickory because he was so tough. Andrew Jackson was also very popular with the common man because of a relatively limited education and a hard-scrabble life in the wilds of Tennessee. He was also a big fan of Thomas Jefferson and considered himself to be a Jeffersonian Democrat, something that played well with the common man as well because Jefferson was an anti-federalist who was supported by the common man. Now, Adams, from Massachusetts, was more of an intellectual. He was very experienced and a little bit eccentric. You can see his resume here on the slide. He'd been a very successful Secretary of State, which is a stepping stone job traditionally to the presidency. If you are someone's Secretary of State, that means you have foreign policy experience that your opponents may not have when you all run for president against each other. So Secretary of State is a plum job, and if you are the Secretary of State and running for president, you kind of have an advantage over other candidates. However, Jackson from Tennessee was a war hero, like I mentioned before. And also he was very favored by the common man, which I also mentioned before because of his background. So heading into this election, you have four main candidates: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and the current Speaker of the House of Representatives at that time, a man named Henry Clay, who would be a major figure in American politics between 1820 and the 1850s, let's say. He was kind of a giant of American politics at that time. So there were some pretty good heavyweights in this election. Well, as you can see here, Jackson would win in the Electoral College with 99 electoral votes. But there's a check mark next to Adams' name, despite the fact that he only had 84 electoral votes. More on that later. William Crawford ended up taking 41 electoral votes, and Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, took 37 electoral votes. Now, again, Jackson wins in the Electoral College 99 to 84, but that's only 42%. It's not a majority. The three others had taken votes away from him. So, according to the 12th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, if a candidate does not receive a majority of the votes, then the election is decided in the House of Representatives. It's still that way today. Now, Henry Clay, who, as you can see on the chart in front of you, finished fourth in the election, was a Speaker of the House of Representatives at that time, and he absolutely hated Andrew Jackson. Now, this is going to set up what becomes called the corrupt bargain of 1824. As you can see here once again, Andrew Jackson clearly leads in the popular vote, and he clearly leads in the Electoral College. But he did not get a majority of the Electoral College votes. He only got 42%. So that means, once again, the issue's got to get settled in the House of Representatives, headed up by the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who can't stand Andrew Jackson. Now, William Crawford is going to be a virtual non-issue in this thing. Eventually, though, Henry Clay is going to get accused of striking a deal with the runner-up, John Quincy Adams. Now, why did Henry Clay seek out John Quincy Adams? Well, first of all, you have to remember that prior to 1820, Henry Clay had been considered the founding father of the quote-unquote American system, which had talked about high tariffs against other countries, transportation systems being built in the infrastructure of the United States. We're talking roads, canals, things like that, and a strong banking system to fund those projects. Now, Henry Clay was the one that created that once again, and John Quincy Adams had been widely known as a strong supporter of the American system. So Clay kind of looked at John Quincy Adams as maybe not necessarily a friend, but a good acquaintance and definitely a supporter. And remember that Clay could not stand Andrew Jackson. So here's what we know. Henry Clay approached John Quincy Adams, and a meeting took place. Now, we'll never know what was said in that meeting, But we do know that a little while later, when the vote happened in the House of Representatives about who should win the presidency of the United States, Henry Clay actively supported John Quincy Adams, despite the fact that Adams had finished second in the election, and Adams was named President of the United States. Now, that in and of itself might seem pretty corrupt. And then there's this layer added on to it as well. Soon afterward, John Quincy Adams, after he becomes president, names Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, which, as you may remember, was a normal prerequisite job for the presidency. In essence, people are accusing Henry Clay of supporting John Quincy Adams so that John Quincy Adams would give him a job that would help Henry Clay win the presidency sometime later in his political career. Now, Jackson, as you can imagine, completely goes ballistic in the public, claiming that a corrupt bargain had been struck to steal the election away from him when he had rightfully won it with a mandate of the people. He, after all, did win in the Electoral College and led in the popular vote, so he had a fairly good point there. But from that point on, it became known as the corrupt bargain of 1824. And as a result of the quote-unquote corrupt bargain, the public never fully embraced John Quincy Adams or his policies. The thing is, we don't know for sure if that's what took place, or if John Quincy Adams simply thought that Henry Clay would be a really good Secretary of State. There is that possibility. But it certainly didn't look good. Well, whether the result was corrupt or not, the bottom line was that John Quincy Adams was now the President of the United States after the election of 1824. And Henry Clay was now the Secretary of State with a pretty good stepping stone to a presidency, possibly later on if you ever wanted to run for it. By the way, that never ended up happening. He did run a number of times, but he never got elected. In any event, let's take a look at John Quincy Adams for a second. Now, John Quincy Adams posed for this photograph, just a little piece of side trivia here. It's the first photograph ever taken of a president. First one ever. All the previous ones had all been portraits. Now, John Quincy Adams, as you can see from the picture here, kind of looks like a cantankerous guy. He's a lot like his dad, John Adams, who wasn't very well liked. John Quincy Adams, like his dad, is short, or was short, bald, sarcastic, tactless, irritable, but was also very philosophical. He was a very intelligent guy, but also pretty eccentric. He used to skinny dip at the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., even on cold winter days. Did that pretty much every morning swim before he went to the office. Now, despite the corrupt bargain that people accused him of, this is one interesting and ironic point about John Quincy Adams. He didn't like politics and he didn't like politicians. By most accounts, John Quincy Adams was a man of honor who disliked patronage, the idea of, I'll do something for you if you do something for me. And as a result, he wouldn't fire effective people just to open up jobs in government for his supporters, something that Andrew Jackson would be well known for later on. He commanded respect rather than seeking popularity, and he actually is known as a man of high integrity. That's why this whole corrupt bargain of 1824 thing seemed so unusual. Now, John Quincy Adams, you would think with that kind of resume and that kind of respect, would have very successful domestic policies. But again, he had the whole corrupt bargain of 1824 thing hanging over his head. He did build roads and canals in support of Henry Clay's American system, which he had been a fan of even before the election of 1824. He wanted a national university and astronomical observatory. He tried to stop land speculation and wildcat banks in the West, reckless loans and buying of land in the West. He supported the Cherokee prior to their forced removal, which was eventually enacted by Andrew Jackson. But the American people didn't react well to any of his policies. They thought they were very high-minded. Building roads and canals meant more taxes. Education and roads were state matters, not federal. So there was a fear of what else he might want to control. Would he possibly want to end the institution of slavery? A lot of southern states were worried about that, if he was willing to do all of these other things. People wanted to expand to the West, so they didn't like the restrictions that John Quincy Adams was placing on them, and Georgia had already said they wanted the Cherokees out, so that policy wasn't necessarily well received either. So by the time the election of 1828 rolls around, you have a guy in John Quincy Adams who actually, despite being accused of this corrupt bargain, is known as a man of high integrity. Again, if there were people in his administration that were doing a good job, even if they were political opponents of his, he kept them on because they were doing a good job. He didn't fire people to make room for his supporters. But again, by the time he hit 1828, that whole corrupt bargain of 1824 thing had never gone away. And the election of 1828 is going to start the modern era of campaigning, as John Quincy Adams, the old quote unquote solid oak, went up against Andrew Jackson, known as Old Hickory. Now, Jackson had been loud and protesting loudly for 4 years about this whole election being quote unquote stolen from him in 1824, so it was pretty obvious that the election of 1828 was going to get pretty nasty as these two guys squared off against each other again. But the central figure of the election of 1828 wouldn't necessarily be John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, or even Henry Clay. The central figure of the 1828 election became this woman that you see in the portrait here. This is Rachel Jackson, the wife of Andrew Jackson. And Adams' people, not John Quincy Adams, it should be pointed out, but the people who ran his campaign, called Andrew Jackson's mother a prostitute and his wife Rachel an adulteress. Now, it had in fact happened that Rachel Jackson had gotten together with Andrew Jackson before she was officially divorced from her first husband. She and her first husband had been separated for quite some time, and under some common law statutes, they actually were divorced. But technically, under some law aspects, they were not. And although she did wait to marry Andrew Jackson until her divorce was official, the John Quincy Adams campaign jumped on this and started calling out Rachel Jackson as an adulteress and Andrew Jackson as being the one who was actually corrupt. Now, Jackson, for his role, turned around and called John Quincy Adams a gambler and a pimp. There was absolutely no basis to any of those accusations. He was just striking back. So, of these two things, John Quincy Adams' camp was actually a little more correct. But man, did the mudsling in this one, and it was the first time in American politics that it had ever gotten this bad. In the end, great fights go to great fighters. And as a result, Jackson's support in the South and the West beats John Quincy Adams 178 to 83 in the Electoral College in the election of 1828. There would be no disputing this result, and John Quincy Adams became a one-term president, while Andrew Jackson began the first of 2 terms in office. Okay, we'll move on in element 2 to a little bit more about Andrew Jackson, so that's it for now. Thanks for listening.